It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the weekly podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch every Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This week kicks off another month of Hammer horror frights with 1961's The Curse of the Werewolf. Now, there's a lot that could potentially be discussed here, but I think we should start with a little bit of history. Before the end of the 1950s, Hammer film productions had risen to the top of the horror heap with films like The Curse of Frankenstein, Horror of Dracula, The Revenge of Frankenstein, The Mummy, and their Quatermass films. They had also produced a movie about the Abominable Snowman and did a version of The Hound of the Baskervilles starring their usual leading men, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. Once the 60s dawned, they shifted slightly away from the marquee attention grabbers of Frankenstein, Dracula, and The Mummy, though each of them would be back by the mid-60s. Instead, they focused on other classic monsters like Dr. Jekyll. In 1960s, The Brides of Dracula still featured Peter Cushing, but featured no actual Dracula. It just dealt with other vampires that the Lord of Darkness created in Transylvania. Within a couple of years, Hammer would also do a version of Phantom of the Opera. However, when it came to the classic monsters, there was still one missing, the Wolfman. Naturally, Hammer couldn't use the name the Wolfman, as that was definitely the property of Universal, but they could do their own take on a werewolf story, and that's what gives us this film. Hammer went back to Terence Fisher, director of those late 50s films starring Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Mummy, as well as the previous year's Dr. Jekyll movie. Fisher was a bit of a maverick of the time. He was the first to really bring gothic horror alive in vibrant color and with the reddest of red blood and with all sorts of sexuality added in. He's probably just as much of the reason for Hammer's success as Cushing and Lee were. And we'll see him a couple more times this month when we look at The Revenge of Frankenstein and The Gorgon. Most significantly, The Curse of the Werewolf would be the first starring role of a young Oliver Reed. Now, Reed's a guy that I feel like could take up the entirety of an episode to just talk about how he lived his life. But he had been in some movies prior to this as either an extra or in relatively small roles in other Terence Fisher films, like The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll and Sword of Sherwood Forest. So it was with this that Fisher came back around to give this young man his first starring role as the cursed youngster who would get a howl out of the full moon. Reed was an extremely complicated man. He was known for being burly, a bit of a brawler, and turned down roles that most people would never conceive of turning down. For example, he claims that he turned down a role in The Sting, but ended up starring in the lesser sequel. He also became a tax exile, as many British entertainers did when taxes were raised in the 70s. He was not part of the original exodus from the United Kingdom because he always thought of himself as a British patriot and a fervent supporter of Margaret Thatcher. He even apparently attempted to re-enlist in the British Army when the Falklands War broke out. But at age 44 at the time, he was turned away. He also became quite the critic and opponent of the feminist movement. On an episode of Johnny Carson, famously, Shelley Winters would dump a cup of whiskey over Reed's head over comments he made that she became rather angry about. And that leads us to Reed's primary legacy. He was known for being a massive alcoholic who would binge drink. There are all sorts of tall but possibly true tales about how he and his mates would really kind of go on these massive benders. Supposedly, he and 36 friends of his drank in one evening, I should say, 60 gallons of beer, 32 bottles of scotch, 17 bottles of gin, 4 crates of wine, and a bottle of something called Baby Cham. He would later correct the story by saying he downed 106 pints of beer on a 2-day binge after he got married. Oh, that seems much more reasonable. I don't know what we're talking about. Now, he did, at one point in time, have Steve McQueen come to a pub in London from the United States to talk about a potential film role. They then went on to do an epic pub crawl for the night that ultimately ended with Reed puking on McQueen. The man could drink, the man could fight, the man could barf. And again, he was a very complicated man, and at times a very difficult man too. But as for The Curse of the Werewolf, the movie opens in Spain, and a voiceover tells us of a beggar who comes into a town that's being ordered to rejoice over the marriage of the town's Marquez. And the locals send the beggar to the castle where the Marquez is celebrating with other nobles. And it turns out that this Marquez is a massive jerk. He blames the chef for preparing goose when his wife doesn't like goose. The chef didn't know that. But he knocks the goose onto the floor and has a hearty laugh when he kicks the chef when he's down. When the beggar shows up, he's treated very poorly by the Marquez, despite the Marquesa begging him to treat the beggar as a man with some respect and not an animal. It's a pretty cruel situation all the way around, but after several indignities performed for the Marquez to get food and drink, the beggar's thrown in prison for saying something that the Marquez takes as inappropriate. Time passes, and the beggar was ultimately forgotten. The only two people who ever saw him in the 15 years that he was in prison was the jailer and the jailer's mute daughter. The jailer would eventually die, but the daughter grew up and continued to care for the beggar. The Marquez's shitty disposition ultimately led to his wife's early death and the loss of all of his friends. When the mute girl does not give the Marquez her name, because she can't speak, she's thrown into the prison with the beggar. Being driven mad as he was, the beggar rapes the poor woman. He dies shortly after, and when the mute girl is allowed to see the Marquez to, entertain him, she stabs and kills the evil old man. She ran away and was living in the forest for some time before being found by the gentleman Don Alfredo Corlido. He learns the woman is with baby, and the mute woman dies in childbirth on Christmas Day. Don Corlido and his maid Teresa, who ultimately explains that the childbirth on Christmas is bad luck, decide to name the child Leon and raise him. Now, when they go to baptize little Leon, a terrible storm erupts and the holy water of the cathedral begins to rumble and quake. But, as it calms down, the baptism is completed. As time passes, a local man's goat is found with its throat torn out. Also, little Leon's kitten is found in the same condition as that goat. The local huntsman thinks that there's a wolf running about, and when the huntsman is sent out to find and kill the wolf, killing the local animals, he fires at what he thinks is a young wolf. The next morning, Don Corlido removes a bullet from Leon's leg. And Don Corlido thinks that the boy must have gotten up late at night and left the house, but Teresa swears that she would have heard him stirring, which makes it believe that possibly he went out through the window. Leon also swears that he didn't leave his bed, but he did have nightmares, though. And as it turns out, Leon has had these bad dreams ever since a hunting trip that he went on with the huntsman named Pepe. And he was upset over a squirrel being shot, and he wanted to try to kiss the squirrel to make it better, but he ended up tasting something warm that ultimately gave him the taste for blood. He also has unnatural hair growth on his arm and the palms of his hands. Meanwhile, Teresa discovers that the bullet in Leon's leg was one of Pepe's, and Don Corlido goes to speak with a local priest and learns that little Leon's unlucky birth has cursed him to become a werewolf. The priest says only love will act as a cure to the werewolf curse. When he grows up, he must find a woman who he not only loves, but would love him in return. So while the locals start to play around with stories about werewolves, Don Corlido installs bars on Leon's windows to help the bad dreams stay away. Now, Pepe decides to smelt his silver crucifix into a bullet and waits for whatever it is that attacked the goats to return. And he thinks he sees the creature, but it's not the werewolf. Meanwhile, Leon is found trying to break out of his room. Leon's partially transformed with hairy arms and fangs, but when Don Corleto puts him back to bed, Leon recovers. Pepe figures he's killed the problem, which turns out to be the shepherd's dog. Now, years pass and Leon turns into Oliver Reed, and he's sent off to seek work and make his own way. He arrives at a vineyard and is immediately put to work. And he takes a shine to a pretty young woman named Christina. But Christina is engaged to be married to someone else, who happens to be the owner of the vineyard. They spark up a pretty torrid love affair, though. And he wants to speak to her father, which happens to be the vintner and his boss, to try to convince him to give her hand to Leon instead. But Christina fears he will be sent away. So Leon's friend Jose, whom he works with at the vineyard, takes him to a brothel to kind of cheer him up. It's the night of a full moon and he begins to transform, and he ultimately kills one of the girls at the brothel as well as Jose. He even returns to his hometown where he kills the old goat herder whose dog was blamed for all of the animal killings 13 years previously. But Leon returns home where Don Corleto, Teresa, and the priest try to reveal to him what is inflicting him, the werewolfism. He has a hard time believing it at first, but realizes that it must be true. And so the priest says that he might be able to make it so that he's allowed into a monastery under special observation, but he would have to be chained up for a time. He does not take this well and runs away, and arrives back at the vineyard where the police are there to question him. He stays at the vineyard where he seemingly is about to change once again until Christina comes to him and spends the night by his side. He begins to realize that with her near, he does not transform as he did previously because, well, she loves him. As they prepare to run away together, the police arrive with Leon's discarded clothes from the night before, and he's arrested for the murders. While he tries to get someone to send for his father, Christina is discovered by her father and fiancé that she was planning to run away with Leon. She learns that he's been taken to prison. Her father is quite upset with her about all of this, and Christina decides to rush to Leon in prison, but Leon asks his father and the priest to tell the guy who runs the town to execute him before sundown. They must then, learn of his curse so that the town will want him dead. So, because if they don't kill him before sundown, he's going to kill again. And when he's interviewed to support his story, Christina arrives and explains that she's the only one who can help him. And with all of that, because she doesn't know anything about his werewolfism, it's determined that Leon must stand trial, but that means he will transform that night. He begs Don Corleto to get Pepe's silver bullet that he made 13 years prior and come back and use it on him. While the Don seeks out Pepe, Leon transforms in his jail cell, one that he happens to share with another prisoner. He kills that guy and starts going on a rampage through the town. Don Corleto returns with Christina and the silver bullet and is forced to destroy his adopted son in the town's bell tower. Now let's get to my 3 things that I like about The Curse of the Werewolf. First up, I really like the structure of this movie. There's a really good backstory to the actual curse itself. Most of the time, you have a werewolf that is turned into one by another werewolf, like in The Wolfman, where the Bela character passes it on to Larry. But then, where did that first werewolf come from that started the whole curse that was continuously passed on to begin with? Well, that's what this movie explores. Leon is a werewolf because of the circumstance of his birth. He's cursed by the fact that he was an unwanted child conceived by rape My words, not the film's. And he was born on Christmas Day, which was supposedly bad luck anyway, and apparently an old version of the werewolf story. He's also not someone who targets people because of a pentagram appearing on them to mark them. He's a monster through and through and kind of indiscriminately kills. It's a different type of werewolf movie, and that makes this unique and even really kind of more of a sympathetic story. Now, second, this feels much more dramatic than other Hammer horrors from the same era. A lot of this is due to Oliver Reed. He's rarely calm in this movie. He's utterly desperate in almost every scene that he's in. Even when he's with Christina, he's off kilter. It's even as if he's already melancholy over the impossibility of them being married. It's a lot less a horror movie, but a melodrama. And through that, it creates tension in a much different way. Now, thirdly, the final 10 minutes of this movie is pretty fantastic. We have Leon hoping for Don Corleone to come back before the full moon rises. Don Corleone needs to find Pepe. The prisoner in the cell with Leon is describing how the full moon is rising and that it's as bright as the daytime. And of course, that sends Leon over the edge, and he begins to change and not only kills his cellmate, but actually tears down the cell door and escapes into the town. Meanwhile, the women of the story, Teresa and Christina, find out that Don Corleone is going to get a silver bullet that was made from a crucifix, which is the only thing that will kill a werewolf. It's mayhem in town, and those who love Leon are trying to figure out how they can help, or if they are simply powerless to watch as he needs to be destroyed. It's good stuff. It's part of that that sympathetic and melodramatic stuff that makes up the first two likes. In addition here, though, there's this really pretty cool gray-coated werewolf fur on Oliver Reed that is just a very unique style for the werewolf and design for the creature that hadn't really been done like that before. Most of the time you think of a werewolf as being something like brown or possibly dark brown or black. But while The Curse of the Werewolf still gets mostly high marks both at the time and currently, even though it's really not that much of a horror movie in the truest of definitions, it was not as successful as most of the other Hammer films. In fact, it was the only werewolf film that Hammer made, instead opting for the more gothic horror provided by vampire films instead. One last funny story about Oliver Reed before we go. While making this movie, he'd often take pleasure in scaring motorists when going home after filming each night because he'd keep his werewolf makeup on while driving. The guy was a character. Now that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. So don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. We continue this month of Hammer Horrors next time with the next entry in the Christopher Lee Dracula series that I have yet to cover, Scars of Dracula. So until next week, stay spooky.